Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Swamiji's wonderful commentary based on Master's teachings. We are on chapter 6, starting with verse 10. So let's start with a prayer, please. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence in everything we do, that we may know that we are being guided. Take us through this tumultuous, ever-changing world with the certainty that you are always with us. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, let's just have a moment of meditation, and then we'll start. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay. Chapter 6, verse 10, in the subject on the book called The True Yoga. Free from the hopes engendered by desires, and untouched by any craving for possession, the waves of feeling in his heart controlled by yoga concentration, the yogi, retiring alone to a quiet place, should try to unite his little self with the Supreme Self. I love to say that, okay, we don't have any hopes engendered by desires, we're untouched by any cravings for possession, the waves of feeling in our hearts are controlled, then we retire to a quiet place. I think we might have to retire to the quiet place in order to try to accomplish some of those things, but what Krishna is describing to us here is how high we should aspire and what the fruit of our right effort will be. Swami spends some time commenting here on the fact that, let's see, those who are able to sit in deep meditation is what he's trying to say. Every other duty that we do is a means to working out our karma, to facing the limitations, whatever they might be in our consciousness, so that we can relinquish desires, calm the feelings of the heart, cease to crave for things outside ourselves, so that when we go into the quiet place, and that quiet place is internal as well as external, that we are able to seek God alone. There's a very interesting statement. Let me think how this went. Master said to Swamiji that before God realization can come, every single desire that we ever have has to be fulfilled. And Swami said to Master at that point, you mean even like when I was 7 years old and I wanted an ice cream cone and I didn't get the ice cream cone and I still wanted it? Master said, yes, every desire. Now, he didn't literally mean that we have to go incarnation after incarnation and eat ice cream and have cheese and drink wine and, just exactly like that. At least I don't think that's what he meant. Although, what draws us back to this world to be reincarnated is longing, Swami said, and regret, but also longing. If you die with a desire unfulfilled, that desire will be restless within you. I have this picture sometimes. I don't have any real visions. I can't visit the astral world. I don't know what it's really like, but having contemplated these truths and listened to Swamiji and read what great saints have said, it's like I can almost see it. But one of the pictures that I have in my mind is how the process of reincarnation sneaks up on us. And so I think of it like this. Maybe I'm home, I've come home for the evening, and I have the whole evening to myself, and I have a plan in my mind. I'm going to chant for a while, then I'm going to read a little bit, then I'm going to meditate, then I'm going to go to bed early so that I can get up early and do the whole thing again with a lot of energy. But just before I sit down to maybe read that really inspiring spiritual book, I'm just a little hungry. So I go downstairs and I open the refrigerator, and then I see in the refrigerator that, I don't quite have what I need. But if I just went to the store over here, which isn't very far away, I'll just get what I need, and I'll just pick it up, and I'll come home, and then I'll have this, and then I'll do this. But then when I go to the store, I run into somebody else that I know, and they say, we were just about to go out for a cup of coffee. Why don't you come with us? And I go off for that cup of coffee. We have a great time, and I finally come home, and I remember, oh yeah, I was going to do something else, wasn't I? It's like we have all these different inclinations stacked up within us. And I can imagine we're there in the astral world and it's all looking pretty good and everything is, just going fine. And then all of a sudden, just it crosses our mind about, that friendship that I really never got to explore. Or I'd really wanted the part in that movie, but I didn't get it. Or, boy, I used to really love pizza, certain kind of pizza, And then all of a sudden, you're there. You just find yourself there because it was a samskar within you. It was a vibration. Now, thinking specifically of that idea that every desire has to be fulfilled before we can realize God. This is an image, and these are images that I've tried to use to help me to understand this. So this is not like the dogma according to Yogananda, but this is how it makes sense to me. The vibration of God realization is so the opposite of what we think it is. Because this world is so enormous and complicated and there's so much going on, when we think about the creator of this world, the mind automatically thinks of ever-expanding complexity. That since the world is so complicated, the creator of it must be the most complicated one of all. And in fact, it's just the opposite, that the power of the Spirit, the one without a second, the eternal, the infinite self, the maker of everything, it's like this enormous wave of energy goes out and takes all these forms, but it all emanates from a point of, ultimately of perfect stillness. So the farther out we get from that origin point, the more there are more ramifications there are, and the more complicated it gets. The closer we get to the source, even you can just see like this, it narrows and narrows. The creation is created by the oscillation of opposites. So the farther out you are from your source, the greater the oscillation. The closer you come into the source, how the vibration begins to, the movement is very slight. You can feel this if you get it ever into a deep state of calmness, whether it comes in meditation, whether it comes just standing by the ocean or alone in a forest or wherever, standing under the night sky. We've all had moments, I hope, where everything becomes very, very still. And we're moving out of the complexity of this world into the absolute simplicity of the divine. And in ultimate realization, everything becomes unmoving in the singularity of the divine. If there is only one, there's no movement. Movement requires that you move away. You have to move somewhere from center But if we're totally at center, everything stops. And it becomes very simple. This is also the meaning of suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of God. The child is simple compared to the endless ramifications of adult life. Now, by definition, we just said there was another thought there. Let me see if I can remember what it was. Oh, yes. Swami made the very unusual statement that I can only repeat because I have no context for understanding it really, just that he said it. He said, when enlightenment comes, in the moment of enlightenment, he said, when you realize your oneness with everything, and you realize that there is now and has only ever been one reality. Swami said, for just a moment, there is a feeling of intense loneliness. Isn't that an interesting way to say it? Because you realize that you are absolutely solitary in the universe. It's a marvelous just image to meditate on. You know, we're always feeling we have this longing for so many things. That's exactly what this verse is talking about. We're always longing. We're longing for companionship, for friendship, to be understood. And then we long for God alone. But Swami said, when we finally realize that there's only one reality in the universe, he said, for just a moment, there's this feeling of intense loneliness. But he said then, almost immediately, it's followed by a feeling of bliss. And so the loneliness is consumed by the bliss. Still fascinating, isn't it? This is all an attempt to put into words that which is so far beyond words. Now, any desire that we have, the hope engendered by desire. Hope engendered by desire means that we want something to happen. And hope is a positive way of thinking about it. Oh, when I get that, I'm going to be happy. Oh, when I see this person, I'm going to be happy. Oh, when I finish this job, I'm going to be happy. We have this desire and we hope that this thing is going to happen. Or he says, craving for possession. So if we have no desires, if we have no cravings for possession, if we have no movement of feeling in the heart, and the movement of feeling in the heart is always either toward attraction or toward aversion. Or you might say moving away because of aversion, but it's movement. Once again, we're moving, aren't we? So something in us is vibrating, and it's vibrating because we are not at rest. You know, to be at rest is that we're not craving, we're not desiring, we're not looking outside ourselves, we're at rest. So anything that you still desire is going to be movement away from that point of rest, isn't it? I mean, that's what makes us restless. I mean, that's what the word is, restless, is because here I am, but I want that. Here I am, I'm going to meditate, but I'm a little bit hungry. Then I open the refrigerator, and what I want is not in the refrigerator, but I know it's at the store. And so all that movement happens because I'm not content where I am. And the movement of the mind, it's not content on the reality of the divine within me. It's not just content to repeat its mantra or its japa or whatever it might be. It's reaching out. I wonder what so-and-so is doing. Why did they talk to me like that? What will I plan for tomorrow? How will I deal with this? Oh, I was so happy thinking about what is happening. Here I am in the possibility of the now, but instead I'm vibrating away from it. Okay? So when Master says all desires have to be fulfilled, you might say equally to say transcended, but in some way they have to be satisfied. They can be satisfied because I have now fulfilled them on a higher vibration. I realize that my desire for ice cream, now I'm just making this up, but this is how it seems to me. My desire for ice cream is the desire for sweetness, and the sweetness of a higher kind of love makes the necessity for that taste not necessary. It seems to me one could transcend. Master actually said it has to be fulfilled, so I'm not really quite sure whether it means literally you have to eat the ice cream, which is very scary when you think about how many desires have gone through your mind. But Kriya Yoga burns up those seeds of karma, so what I'm saying also has truth. The vibration is satisfied on a higher level. But as long as any desire is there, you're going to be restless and you're going to be moving off of the stillness of one. And so all desires have to be fulfilled in one way or another, because otherwise we will never rest content. Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? And that's what this verse says. When hopes engendered by desires are gone, we're not attached and craving for possessions, we don't have these oscillating feelings, we have been able to control them by yogic, it says controlled by yogic concentration. Meaning instead of letting my thoughts just wander, I focus. And then I go out into a solid place, and in that stillness, I can lift my spirit up to the divine. And it tells us how to get there. This is what we have to work with. And this is why all of spiritual life, all of life, becomes sadhana. Because in every circumstance, these are the things that are running through us. Desires, craving for possessions, different feelings in the heart. So there's never a moment of conscious living, which is all living. There's never a moment of living when we're not making choices. And those choices are going to constantly rebound back on us and make us restless. And that restlessness will keep us from union with God. So, at least speaking for myself, one of the things I love about the spiritual path is that I can always be doing it. Always. There's not a single circumstance in which you don't have the opportunity to practice the presence of God. In the very best, most joyful, uplifted, we can either lose ourselves in the outward reality, or we can enjoy it from the center with the joy of God. And in the most dire, difficult, painful, sad circumstance, we can always retreat to what Master called the portable paradise within. And instead of letting ourselves get tossed around by the ever-changing, we rest contentedly in the heart. And then just on a very practical level, according to this verse, Swami translates it into everyday life. Practice solitude. Take yourself to a quiet place. Devote a day a week if you can, or a week a month, or a day a month, or a week or two every year, in which we practice being still. I haven't in the last couple of years, just because of the way our lives have been since the pandemic started. This is being recorded in November 2021. But it has always been my habit to take at least a week or two of seclusion, and when I was writing, I took many weeks of seclusion. I was never very good at taking short seclusions, like 2 or 3 days. I would always have to take at least a couple of weeks, because it would take me a couple of days, as I would put it, to get Asha to just go away. Because the habit of the personality and all, it's active. It's a very active personality. It's always doing things and thinking things and talking about things. And it would take a couple of days for all of that to just realize that there was no necessity for that anymore. And highly recommend it, this just wonderful realization that I don't always have to be doing. Sometimes I can just be. One of my happiest seclusion memories, when I took seclusion somewhere at Ananda Village in a little cottage there, the weather, it was probably spring. So it was sunny, it wasn't raining, but it was a little chilly. And I remember taking a down comforter that I had, and just in the middle of the day, just lying down under the trees, sort of on and under the comforter, like this, It's very vivid memory, and I remember just lying there for a very long time, just looking at the trees and watching the sky behind it. And what was so notable about it was the reason I could do it is because my mind wasn't compelling me in 100 directions. It's that I was not able to unite with the infinite spirit, but I had put down all other duties. I had just laid them down, and I really had nothing to do except commune, which is what I was doing when I was in the trees and in the clouds. And that must have been at least 30 years ago. And I can still just vividly remember what it looked like and what it felt like to just be that still. I had another fun experience that way. This was much earlier, in the early 70s. It was probably about 1975 or so. Swami was working on the path. And I was at his house, what is now Crystal Hermitage, but then was a single dome. And I was there with my friend Seva, because most of the time when I was with Swami, she was also there. And they were talking, they were doing something over here, and I was sitting just a little apart and slightly out of Swami's sight. I think after he would work a lot writing, sometimes his head would literally, his brain would get very hot. And I think she was giving him a head rub. That's what it was. So his head was, he was sitting, looking this way. She was standing behind him and just sort of taking a lot of that heat out of his head. And I was sitting over here out of his sight. And after a moment or two, or after a little while, Swami said, "Asha, are you still here?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm sitting," and I spoke. He heard my voice, but he couldn't turn his head because she was working on him. And he said, "Why can't I feel your consciousness?" And I said, "Because it's much calmer than it usually is. Because somehow sitting there, some vibration had descended into me, and I was exactly that. I was very, very still, and my mind wasn't driving in all directions like it usually was." He says, "Why can't I feel your consciousness?" I said, "Because it's much stiller than it usually is." And then Swami shut his eyes and he was silent for a moment. He says, "Ah, yes, there you are." And it was very sweet, but it was also very interesting to me because, in fact, my consciousness had shifted, so he didn't know where I was. Because usually he knew me because of this certain, energy that was my constant nature, but it went away from me for a moment. And he recognized people by their vibration, and my vibration had shifted, so he didn't know where I was in the room. Isn't that interesting? But that's what we're doing when we're meditating. We're trying to get back to the one. So Krishna says, take yourself into solitude. When that calmness comes, prize that above all things, because the only duty we have is to unite our spirit with God. And I was starting to say, all the other action that we take, all the other work that we do, and Swami reminds us in the commentary here that there have been a lot of verses about the necessity to act, that merely to refrain from action is not the same as stillness. Stillness is when all these cravings and oscillations of consciousness are gone. Merely to hold back from outward action, the necessity to restrain that energy is in itself the opposite of stillness. So we get to do all this work. We get to create, we get to learn, we get to struggle, we get to face our fears, we get to learn how to love, we have to learn how to receive love, we have to do our duty in countless ways. But the reason we're doing all of those things is to have the experiences we need to understand that I need to give up my desires, I need to give up my cravings, I need to use my yogic techniques to control this wild oscillation of feeling. But nobody believes that you ought to do that until you've had enough experience of the folly of not doing that. And you can't tell people. I remember, and I've shared with many of you before, for some strange reason, when one is new on the path, I've seen it before and I fell into it too. One thinks overcoming desires is an attractive opening line in trying to entice other people onto the spiritual path. Nobody wants to overcome desires. They want to be taught how to fulfill them. But for some reason, I fell into it too. I'm on the excuses. I was probably 19 years old. But I remember talking to a relative and saying, trying to explain to her how desires were inherently unsatisfying. And so I was giving my little sermon about you have your desires and you long for these things and then they come to you and then after a while they don't fulfill you. And she was just totally with me. She was completely agreeing with me. But after I laid out my case about how desires are, they never give you what you really want, she just so seriously said to me, that's why you have to keep on wanting new things. It was 100% the opposite of what I was trying to say. But that was how she lived, and not very happily, I have to add, for much of her life. She got better toward the end, but that was how she lived. Oh, this is boring, I'll go to another. This is boring, I'll go to another. This is boring, I'll go to another. And you can't tell someone not to do that. You have to wake up to this. And this is where Master's phrase in Autobiography of a Yogi, the anguishing monotony. That's the word he used. And that is really what begins to happen in its past lives. What I mean is, it's the accumulated experience of many lives. That you just sort of, the only slang that Swami really enjoyed, he was not much for slang, but he really liked the expression, been there, done that. He thought that was a marvelous use of language. And it's true. You just reach a point where there's nothing really terrible about it. But I've been there and I've done that. And I know it's not going to work for me. I just had this gradually growing came to me, sort of nightmare fear that I would get married. And whoever I married, I thought in very conventional terms, I would have children, I would raise children, and there would be a husband, and the husband would make money, and we would have a little house, and we would have children, and we would have a dog. And at that point, I thought in terms of a station wagon. Now you have a little SUV. And I just saw the whole thing, and on one hand, it was a perfectly natural life to me. I could just see it so easily. And on the other, it was a nightmare, just a nightmare. Not because it was going to be terrible, but because of the anguishing monotony of it. I've done this before. I know the beginning, the middle, and the end of this story. Must I just repeat this loop? So when I found Ananda and met Swami and realized there was an entirely other alternative, well, I never looked back because of the anguishing monotony of it. But we finally calm the hopes that come from desire. And now understand, and this is a very important part of it, it's not really the form of our life that matters. It's whether we have false hopes in relation to that form, or whether we are helpless being driven by our desires. So what I've come to in my life is, I don't really care what the circumstances of my life are. I just don't want to be compelled by desire. I'll do whatever God asks me to do or whatever He gives me to do, and I'll do my best to carry it out well. But I would like to rest in the center. And if it has to spin around me, let it spin around me, but let me rest in the center. And of course, the only way, as I started, that you can come to that rest is that if all the things that this verse in the Gita says. So, okay, let's see what else we can say. Okay, let's go to the next verse, chapter 6, verse 11. Now this is beginning, and there's a couple of verses here where actually Krishna teaches us how to meditate. He doesn't give us, detailed techniques, but he's giving us the basic idea of how we should go about meditating, which is very nice of him to do that. The yogi should have a firm, clean seat, neither too high nor too low. He should cover his seat first with kusha grass, then cover that with a deer or tiger skin, and then place upon that a wool or a silk cloth. Now, Swami touches slightly on here. There are very dogmatic Krishna bhaktis who say that we're not supposed to meditate because in America, because the Gita tells us to sit on kusha grass, and since kusha grass doesn't grow in America, therefore Krishna doesn't want Americans to meditate. It's a fairly tortured argument, but Swami touches on it and tries to sort of put more sane pictures. He said, kusha grass is a very coarse grass which, when woven together, protects the meditating yogi from the dampness of the earth. And now, then we go, each of these three layers, the kusha grass, the animal skin, and the fabric of silk or wool, all of it has what Yogananda talks about is an insulating effect against certain downward currents in the earth. Now, when I hear about things like that, of course, it's easy to understand what those words mean. And it's also easy to understand that there's a lot of magnetic forces roiling around the world. The whole science of astrology, in which we talk about the effect that the planets have on our consciousness and how the planets actually can affect our destiny, and how experiences we have can be intensified by the placements of the planets in the sky or the placements of the planets in our horoscopes. It can all seem extremely far out unless and until you're in a position where you're able to either understand for yourself or have someone else who understands explain it to you. And you have certain life experiences, and the science of astrology will show you why those are happening. And you can have experiences that even can be predicted in the future based on your the planetary positions. There was a friend, and not a close friend, but a man I knew well, who had been a very successful entrepreneur. And he'd created a very successful company, and he had quite a few people working for him, and he was financially very well off, and it was earned. He was very good at what he did. Then he had a client, and that client was involved in something nefarious, and that through associations that client had, there was real illegal activity, which came through and caused the client to get in trouble. Now, nothing that my friend was doing with that man was in any way related to the illegal activity. But those governmental law enforcement agencies that were investigating the client directed their investigation at my friend. And this unrelenting process of investigation started that gradually destroyed the man's entire business. And there was just seemingly nothing that he could do about it. And it went on for 2 years, and finally there was a hearing in which they were still just sort of roiling their way through this. By now his business is entirely gone. He's had to let all his employees go. This is a true story. This happened just a few years ago. They come to this hearing, and they have all the same materials they've been presenting all along, and all of a sudden the prosecuting authorities for the government dropped the case. Just like that, after 2 years, after completely bringing him to the ground. And it was his birthday. Okay, so all of this happens, and it's dramatic enough, and because this man is a very strong man, he's managed quite comfortably to rebuild his life in a different way. So the story has it was a terrible interlude, and then life went on. About a year or two after all of this happened, this is an Indian man, but he grew up, I believe, in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, somehow or another, he gets reconnected with some of the family in India, and they have this horoscope that was done by an astrologer when he was born, because his grandfather wanted to do a horoscope for him. So there's this whole horoscope, but it's written out in an Indian language that my friend did not speak. So we had to get it translated. So he gets this whole thing translated. It says, you'll be an entrepreneur, you'll be very successful, this will happen. On this date, you will become targeted by the government, and everything that you've accomplished will be destroyed, but 2 years later on your birthday it will stop. This was done when he was born. And it was like, what? But there it was. That was just, the whole thing was just charted out, and it went out. He didn't know it in advance, because he never saw it till afterwards. But this was going to happen to him. Who can say? Now, these are planetary influences. These are planetary patterns. I just am putting that out just because it's fascinating, isn't it? In my own little life at the present time, that my housemate happens to be an astrologer. So I've really never understood much about astrology, and I certainly don't know enough to be able to follow it. But it's been very interesting when certain conditions come, when I have certain mental states, when things happen. I'll often ask him, like, what's going on today in my horoscope? And to an appalling degree, just an absolutely humiliating, embarrassing degree, if I think about having any free will, I'm just like a poster child for astrological influences. Not because I even know what they are, but just like, oh yeah, that's pretty much what today was. Oh yeah, that's what's been going on for this last month. Oh yeah, that you describe is exactly how I've been feeling. So I use this as an example because I have some personal experience, and because Swamiji wrote a book about astrology and the true practice of astrology, not a, what would I say, a superficial practice of it, but the true practice. The planetary, the chakras have the planets are an external manifestation of the pattern of energy in the chakras. That's why it works. In other words, everything in this universe is interrelated. And so we choose to be born at the moment when the planets have set themselves up, that they are in harmony with the flow of energy, that our samskars, our past life experiences, our karma, in other words, is going to compel us to follow. So we're talking now about kusha grass and things like that. But what we're saying is there's a lot of forces in the world that we don't really know anything about. And there's a chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi. It's called Outwitting the Stars. And it's about astrology. And Master himself, his final conclusion in that chapter is man's free will is stronger than any planetary influence, which is why he calls it outwitting the stars. But that doesn't mean the planetary influence doesn't exist. And Master himself said, just to prove his independence, sometimes he would get an astrologer to suggest the most inauspicious time for him to try to accomplish something, and he would use his willpower to accomplish it anyway. But he said it was always much more difficult. But it could be done. But just the tide is pushing against you, but you can swim against the tide if you have enough energy to do it. Well, and in Outwitting the Stars, Master talks about gemstones and precious metals, and how his guru had him wear a bangle that was lead, a particular lead bangle. Seems like there was another metal in it to create the right vibrations to offset certain karmic inclinations that were indicated by astrology. You wear gemstones that are related to certain planets in your horoscope. that need to be strengthened in a certain way. Interestingly, astrologers said that Princess Diana, who was killed in that terrible wreck quite a few years ago, Princess Diana of England, this is just something I read. She had a boyfriend at that time who was extremely wealthy, who had gifted her with some huge sapphire necklace. The astrologer said that sapphires were very, very inauspicious for her, and that the wearing of all those sapphires did not help her positive magnetism. It would be impossible to say that she died because she was wearing a sapphire necklace, but it certainly brought malefic forces to bear upon her rather than uplifting ones. So you can't just outwit the stars by piling on gemstones and precious metals. You have to do it in harmony with all of that. So coming back to, Master starts by saying, Krishna starts by saying, that there is a force that holds us to the earth, and we don't just mean gravity. What we're talking about is and these are the words, the way all this is explained, Satchidananda, the infinite spirit, manifests creation. And so the nature of creation is that there is an outward pulling energy, because our source is the divine. This is what I was saying earlier. We want to come back to that point of stillness in which the little self is united with the infinite self. And there's this the infinite is constantly pulling us back. It's exactly the way a river runs to the sea. Everything in this world is symbolic. Everything in the material world is a symbol of a higher reality. And the way the river runs to the sea, and it will find its way. It just knows where the sea is. How do it know? How does it know where it's supposed to go? But it will just move forcefully in that direction and will end when it merges into the ocean. And that's a perfect symbol of the individual jiva, which is the bubble of the ocean, that the ocean has spewed us out in this direction. And there's momentum. We become interested. These are the desires and the cravings and the oscillation of feeling. We are the source. The source of light is within ourselves, but it projects outward, and the world is made of tinfoil, is the way to think about it. So that light shines on that reflective surface. The reflective surface shines back on us, and we think the source of light is there. The source of light is actually coming from us, but it's reflected back, and we think that that's where the source is. And just watch yourself for a day, just reaching out, reaching out, reaching out, reaching out. I was with a friend when her daughter was born, and the child had a little bit of congestion, a little bit of distress, and so the baby was whisked away, and the father followed the baby, and I followed the father and the baby. Baby was 90 seconds old, maybe at this point, maybe a giant 2 minutes. She reaches right up and takes her father's hand just like this. And of course, it was exquisitely beautiful, and just, he's weeping, I'm weeping, everybody's weeping. It's so beautiful. On the other hand, I thought, oh my gosh, this little girl hasn't been on the planet outside of the womb, at least, for 5 minutes. And already she's reaching out to see what she can experience and what she can get. That's the way this world is. There's this forceful, outward moving energy. But there's slightly stronger is the call of home, to come back home to spirit. And so we learn, just like I was saying a little while ago, you can't persuade someone. We just have to keep trying until the pattern of aspiration and disappointment, not because this is an awful place, and it is an awful place, but that's, a matter of a point of view. But it's the it's the realization that the fulfillment that I know is mine, that I know is intended for me, I just can't quite make it happen. And Swami said so wonderfully. He said, we learn from having our desires thwarted, but we learn more from having our desires fulfilled, which is also a very interesting thing to meditate on. Because if your desires are thwarted, you may adjust to it, you may accept it as necessary, you may become very philosophical about it, but there's a piece of us that thinks, but I would have been happier if it hadn't been thwarted. So when we really learn is when our desire is fulfilled. Because then you have it. And you take that cup that you craved so long and you drink it all the way down to the bottom. And it's great. But that fulfillment, which I know is really my true destiny, it's not there. And then you know, oh, this is not really going to work. And that's why in a movement like Ananda, where as one of my, person who came to our church briefly said to me, I visited lots of, New Age, Eastern churches, and they all talk about overcoming the ego, but I have the impression that you all actually mean it, which was just perfect because we do. We actually mean it. And she never came again because it was nice to talk about it, but to actually mean that she's not going to learn how to manifest all her wishes and all of that, which is great because that's what you have to do. But when you have all those desires fulfilled, but what I was going to say, that's why for a movement like Ananda, we don't tend to draw from an impoverished population. Because people who are still hoping that if they can just get a little richer, a little more stuff, a little more of what the world has to offer, then they'll be really happy. If you still haven't fulfilled those desires, then you're really not interested in a teaching that tells you to transcend them. So we tend to draw from people who are more successful in the world. Not wildly successful as a rule, because people who are wildly successful in the world are too committed to it. But people who function, who could fulfill their desires, but are less interested in doing so. I remember at the height of working hard to build this community and putting out all the energy we had to put out to make it come together. I remember joking, wow, if we were just working for ourselves, we'd be so rich by now. Which I'm sure I have been. But been there, done that. That's what it means. That was why even like that idea that I would marry, that I would raise children, that we would be comfortable and all these different things. It's like, yeah, I could do that, but the anguishing monotony of it. But if I'd never had it, or it had never quite worked out, I would still imagine it would be better. That's why it's considered good karma to be born in, at least relatively speaking, into a comfortable home, or a house where more of your desires can be fulfilled. Because if you can fulfill more of your desires, you'll know just how much happiness they'll bring you. And you'll be ready to move on to something else. So, let's go back to, let's see, where are we? Right. So, Krishna's giving us instructions. Kusha grass, then animal skin. And now these are all the traditional things, and they're very interesting. They recommend a tiger or a deer skin, that you should meditate on a tiger or a deer skin. They recommend that, unless you're more highly advanced, that a tiger might have too much energy for you, that a deer skin is more peaceable. Preferably, I love the way they put this, a tiger or a deer that has died of natural causes. Although Swami puts in here that there was a clear bullet hole in the tiger skin that Master used to sit on. So apparently it wasn't absolutely essential. I've always found it odd that you would have an animal skin. It's just, I think I'm just a little too, I don't know what it would be. Swami has a tiger skin. Swami has both a tiger skin and a deer skin. He read this in the Gita. Master sat on a tiger skin. So I just doesn't inspire me, the idea. I have had, however, a sheepskin, which I guess is actually an animal skin too, because it's not just a wool blanket. If it's an actual sheepskin with the leather on the back, I never thought of it because it didn't look like an animal to me. But as a matter of fact, I've been sitting on a sheepskin all my meditating life, and Swami bought it for me, gave it to me as a gift. So there you have it. I just realized the hypocrisy of my own point of view. But Swami also says that the kusha grass, the animal skin, and then the wool or the silk, especially the silk, he said they also represent the first three chakras. The kusha grass is the earth chakra. The animal skin with the life, he says, is the water chakra, because living beings have the circulating blood, and the water is the means of life for a living creature. So the kusha grass is the earth, the animal skin is the water, and silk, because it has an electric charge to it, is the fire element. So Swami just puts forth, which is what Master said, that in addition to whatever insulating properties they have against the downward pulling energy of the earth, there's also some symbolic picture here where we're trying to master the elements of the lower three chakras so that we can lift that energy up to the spiritual eye. As a practical matter, Swamiji says that silk and wool are sufficient because kusha grass doesn't go, at least not in this country, and dead tigers are harder to find these days, and dead deers are also harder to find. But there it is. It's right there in the Gita. So is it symbolic, referring to those chakras? It's at least literal in some sense, because Master said also to use the silk. And if you're, and then Master modified all those directions. I mean, modified it in the sense that in the West, we sit on chairs. In India, people sit on the floor all through their whole lives, and they're quite comfortable on the floor, and they don't need. But in the West, we grow up sitting on chairs, and so it's to train your body to be comfortable on the floor. It's not practical, and Master just said it's completely unnecessary. So he trained Westerners just to sit up in a chair. But he did say, take your silk or take your wool and spread it over the whole chair and under your feet so that it's between you and the earth at all times. I can't say that I can feel it, but I have no reason to disbelieve him. I mean, I do a lot of things that I can't exactly feel, but I would rather take his word for it than just my inexperienced opinion. But I have the sheepskin, and I've been meditating on it for years. So it also, I mean, there's another part here, which is these natural elements absorb the vibrations of what you're doing. And when you set yourself up and always meditate with this in the same place, you know, sitting on the same chair or sitting on the same pieces of fabric, the vibrations of what you're doing there, the objects that you use, they begin to absorb the vibrations of what you're doing. So every time you put that shawl around you or sit down on that sheepskin or that bench or that chair, and going through these instructions, Swami says to us, you know, it's very helpful to have a designated meditation place that you use consistently and that you only use for that purpose. So that just stepping into that space, ideally, is to set aside a whole room in your house that you can set up to be your whole meditation room, and you only go in there for spiritual purposes. Secondarily, it's to have a place in your house maybe that you can screen off, or at least that's defined. I live in this house, but I really live in my room, and I have a relatively spacious bedroom, and then I just have a corner of it that's set up for meditation. And it's in the corner, so I don't walk across it. So whenever I want to sit in front of my altar, I move into that space. And by now, it's long association that as soon as I'm in that space, I know what's supposed to happen there. And we want to use all of these positive reinforcements because there's so many contrary pulls, including the very pull of the earth. One of the things, the other thing about the tiger skin, it says it's better if you're going to meditate on a tiger skin that you have a minimum of sexual activity, preferably abstinence, because the power of the tiger, you don't want to be pulling in two different directions. This is just one of those esoteric things that they mention. But they do, let me just think what I was going to say here. But they do talk in I'm just wanting to see where exactly it's mentioned. But it isn't necessary for meditation practice that you be a brahmachari, which is that you be celibate. And in fact, that's one of the things that is shifting in this age. When Lahiri Mahashaya met his guru Babaji in the Himalayas and was initiated into Kriya Yoga, and then found out that instead of being able to stay with his guru now, his guru was going to send him back to his life in Varanasi, where he was a government accountant, and he was a married man with children, modest responsibilities as they describe, but he wasn't going to leave all of that life behind, but instead he was going to continue that life and still be a meditating yogi. So at first, is the way the story is told in autobiography, Babaji said to Lahiri, only give this sacred Kriya technique to those who are willing to renounce everything in order to follow the spiritual path. Now, I'm going to paraphrase, but essentially, Lahiri said to Babaji, well, I guess I won't be giving very many initiations because there are very few people who are able to renounce the world for God. But then Lahiri Mahashaya pleaded our cause and said, but there are many suffering, great masses of suffering humanity who would be greatly uplifted by this Kriya technique. And so Babaji revised his instructions and said that he should give Kriya initiation to all those who humbly seek. So we owe Lahiri Mahashaya a great debt of gratitude because of his intercession. All of us who are much more integrated into the world than some Himalayan yogi, we're still blessed to be able to have this meditation technique. So all of these elements all play together, and this is what we have to. Swamiji wrote his 14 steps to his 14 lessons on Raja Yoga. And when he finally gave the title to that book, The Art and Science of Raja Yoga. Now, Raja Yoga translates to the king's pathway, which is to say the most elevated pathway to God realization. And Raja Yoga is the science of meditation, of bhakti, of service, of all the things that we combine on this path. And it's a science. And here we're talking about you insulate your body from the downward pulling energy of the earth so that you'll be more free to have the Kundalini energy rise, because the wool and the silk will neutralize the downward pulling energy of the earth. And that's not somebody's interpretation. That's the physics of this planet. That's the way it works. So there's a science to it. There's a science for how you use the breath and concentrating at the spiritual eye and working with the vrittis in the chakras, the whirlpools of past karma, and how you can redirect that energy. There's a profound science of how we face and overcome our desires, how we conduct ourselves in the world, the yamas and the niyamas of Patanjali, which talk to us about what attitudes bring what results and what perfection of these virtues will bring what automatic karmic consequences. We talk about meditating facing east because they're positive currents. These are all the science of it. And you can cooperate with the way things are. Just any craft that you practice, there are certain techniques that people have learned that will make it easier for you. You know, a carefully trained musician, when at the beginning it might be easier to hold your hand a certain way, just easier or more natural, and you might resist when, if you have a good teacher, they try to get you right from the start to learn the right habits, because they know what the science of it is, that even though at this stage it won't matter, as you progress, that position will not allow you to be as effective as if you do it this way right from the start. That's the science of it. But you can go to art school and you can learn everything there is about all the known techniques, but at a certain point, all that science has to be translated into art. And that art is something that wells up out of you from the inner reality of our unique consciousness as a jiva. And even to put it more, Master said that you only have to practice 1% of what he taught. I thought for many years it was 10%, but I recently learned that he actually said 1% of what he taught. But he said everyone takes a different 1%. So that's why he had to teach so much, because he had to provide enough that everybody could find just what they needed in order to bring themselves into alignment. Because another way to think about it is, you see, we tend to think of the spiritual path as linear, like we're all lined up, on the race line, and we all start and we all go from here to the end of the course. So you can always look and see who's behind and who's in front of you, and you can tell exactly where you are and how much farther you have to go. This is what we think. This is entirely wrong, but this is what we think. So we just think it's a very straightforward like this. It's actually quite different than that, because what the reality of spiritual progress is that we live at the periphery of our true being. And spiritual progress is coming home. Just as I've used that image multiple times already this evening when we've talked about it. The river is seeking the sea. And we reach outward like that little newborn baby did to see what this world can give us, and we try to find fulfillment. And the light source is actually projecting through us, but it's reflecting back. And we think the reflection is the source. So we pursue it as if it's going to fulfill us. But all of it is a movement away from what is our true resting place. Our hearts are restless, and they will be forever restless until we find our rest in God. And where the divine resides, the kingdom of God is within. And it's within our own consciousness. I automatically put my hand toward my heart, because we tend to think of the heart, and rightly so, as the source of our being. But it transcends this world entirely, this plane of consciousness. And we find our home within ourselves, but that self is other than we think it is. It's not the physical body we find our home in. It's the origin point of our reality. Now, the capacity, I was going to say, to get to the origin point. So what it really is like, you can think of it as a big wheel, thinking of a bicycle wheel, which often has all these spokes going out. the bicycle wheel, and then you think of the hub of the wheel. And we're arrayed on the rim. And, you know, if you think of all of humanity, and also if you think of creation emanating from the hub of the wheel, from the center of that reality, and with a burst of energy, with a starburst of energy, Sat Chitananda, the ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss of the divine, in a burst of wild enthusiasm, just spreads out in all directions. Every picture you have of a starburst, that starburst goes out equally in all directions, filling in this circle all the way out to the rim. So we're manifested out like that, or more truly, we come down to the base of the spine. But we're manifested out, and then we live on the rim. We run around the rim. Just like my friend, if this disappoints, then I'll go to that. And if this disappoints, I'll go to that. And people spend millions of incarnations. We spend millions of incarnations running around that rim like that, until it gradually occurs to us because also the other way to think about this is everything, if you think of the origin point as the hub of the wheel, by the time you get out to the rim, it's highly diluted. And see, that's why it doesn't fill us, because it's highly diluted. What will fulfill us is the origin point itself. But we've taken a tiny little strand and we're trying to suck the power of everything, but it's highly diluted because it's burst out from there, and this is the pulsing heart of it. And at some point, you don't come onto a path of self-realization until it has occurred to you that what I'm seeking is within. It's not outside me, it's within, however we understand those words. So instead of just running around the rim looking for new experiences, we start trying to come back to our point of origin. And that's exactly what it feels like, isn't it? We just bring our energy in. I mean, the language says it. We become more centered in ourselves. We lift ourselves to a higher level of reality. I mean, it's Swami's wonderful explanation of originality, and speaking of creative arts even, but of life. Originality is not to do something that's never been done before. It's to act from our own point of origin. And that point of origin is not the periphery, not the furthest burst of us, but back to the pulsing heart of what that is. So we start heading toward the center, but everybody's heading toward the center from all these different directions. And so you can't just sort of see where are other people, because you don't even know. Everybody's coming closer and closer to their own point of origin. Now, just to make it a little more actual, what it feels like is, we don't, unfortunately, that's not linear. That movement is not linear. On a bicycle, you have a straight spoke. And so you're here, you get the spoke, and you slide down it to the hub of the wheel. But that's not what it's like. The trajectory back to the center is the wildest, craziest, multi-directional squiggle that you can ever imagine. We head for the origin point, and suddenly we're back to the rim. We scooter along the rim. We shoot down. We're such concentration. We get to the center point. We sail right past it because we've forgotten what we're actually doing. Instead of going to the center, we're just going south. So we go so far south that we sail right past it, and then we have to make a U-turn and we have to go back up this way. But on the way, we get very interested in what's over here to the east. So you just draw it like that. Who's ahead, who's behind, who's closer, who's not. Only God knows. And we don't know it all. And a very simple thing is you don't know how much of the compulsion is left. The way Master put it, if you've got a nail that's driven in the wall, but you didn't drive it in, or you don't remember driving it in, so you don't know how long it is. Is it 7 inches? Is it 1 inch? And so when you start pulling it, you don't know if it's just about to pop out, or if you're going to just have to pull and pull and pull and pull and pull. And so it is. We're just moving all along. And as we gradually get closer and closer, it gets clearer and more simple and less complicated in certain ways. Even if life is very complex. Swamiji's life was, enormously complicated and filled with, lots of fun activities of all different kinds. The book I wrote, Light Bearer, about his life year by year, it's just huff, puff, every year. Just so much would happen. But from his point of view, and this is the most important thing, it was all very simple. There was a great deal involved, but he operated from his point of origin. So the enormous complexity that other people would see, Swami just saw it as very simple. I'm serving my guru, that's all. And the form that it took was incidental, but I'm serving my guru. That's what Mother Teresa of Calcutta said when a journalist who was following her around, saw her lifting this maggot-infested dying beggar out of a gutter to take back to her house of the dying. And the journalist couldn't help but say something like, how can you stand doing that? Oh, she said, you see this maggot-infested dying beggar. She said, I see the face of Christ. And when someone spoke to her about how much good she was doing for the poor and all these different things like that, the way people think, she said, I'm not helping the poor. She said, I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do. Now, it happened to be, it looked like helping the poor, because that was what he'd asked her, that's how he'd asked her to behave. But in her own heart, she wasn't helping the poor. So she didn't worry about how many poor got helped and how many didn't get helped. She worried about, she was concerned only with, I want to do what Jesus asked me to do. And the extraordinary implication of that, which is, you see, now we get back to the Bhagavad Gita when they talk about non-attachment. She wasn't attached to helping the poor. She was attached to helping Jesus. But of course, to do what Jesus asked you to do is to come to the point of origin of your own self. So if Jesus said to her in the morning, leave Calcutta, go live in London. I've arranged a beautiful townhouse for you, go live in London. She would have left immediately. And Swamiji often said that to us. I mentioned earlier he had these 3 houses in 3 places. I think I said that in this, if I didn't, but he did. He lived on 3 continents, and by the end he had a house in every place. And they were comfortable houses, but they weren't fancy. In Assisi, it was just this very small, one-bedroom house. Actually, in India, the complex where his apartment in Ananda village is, there's a whole community center, but Swami still has a small one-bedroom apartment. That's what he lives in, what he lived in, which was comfortable, but by no means luxurious on any level. Just comfortable, just what he needed, just enough for him to do the work that he needed to do. But he always said, I could walk away from it all and and never look back. And he wasn't showing off when he said that, and he wasn't in any way exaggerating, because he was exactly like Mother Teresa. He was doing what he felt Swami Master wanted him to do. So implied in that was not, I would toss it aside out of some restless wish on my part to escape from responsibility. It was, if Master called me, I would leave now. Just like that. And you would just trust because you're acting from your point of origin. So it's a very important thing to remember, because that's the only thing that matters. And we get caught up in the way things look from the outside. But how they look from the outside just doesn't make any difference. They can also look really impressive from the outside and not be very impressive at all. Because if we're only living from the outside. So anyway, coming all the way back to this, excuse me, I need to clear my throat. Coming all the way back to this, Swami called it the art and science of Raja Yoga, which is we have to ask ourselves, Where am I in relation to my center? And of all the techniques that are available to me, what do I need to do to bring myself back to my center? There's wonderful stories of the contradictory advice that the Guru gives to the disciples, depending on what the disciple needs. There's this story told about Sri Ramakrishna, two different disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna did his divine Leela at this temple in a suburb of Calcutta called Dakshineshwar. And it's a Kali temple, and it's right on the Ganges. And when he was living, he died in the late 1800s. When his disciples would come from Calcutta to that temple, they would usually or often come on a riverboat down the Ganges. And so there was a ferry that they would often take. And Ramakrishna was a very controversial character. I mean, of course, once the saint is dead and all the weird contradictions are sort of resolved and everybody begins to agree on his saintliness, and he's not there to do wildly unpredictable things that challenge your preconceptions. Ramakrishna was thought by some to be a complete madman. He was so eccentric in the extremeness with which he followed and the passion with which he followed the spiritual path. So it would happen that when people were on the ferry boat coming down the river, and if you were a passenger who was going to get off at the Ghat, there at the Kali temple, and you were going to see this holy man or this madman, depending on what your point of view was, there would often be discussion among the passengers about who he was and what he was like. And so one of Ramakrishna's disciples is on the ferry boat, and people begin to speak about Ramakrishna and what a crazy person he is, and how some people are gullible enough to think he's a spiritual person, but he's not a spiritual person. No spiritual person would behave the way Ramakrishna was behaving. And the disciple thinks to himself, well, what do they know? I know Ramakrishna. I know he's a great saint. Let them talk. Why should I fight with them? When he lands at the Ghat, Ramakrishna is there to greet him. And Ramakrishna was very unpredictable. And Ramakrishna, who is this great saint, he's weeping. And he's weeping and he's saying to him, how could you let those people say those mean things about me? If you loved me, you would defend me. Is there no one who will defend me from the insults and the outrageous accusations of these people? Okay. The next time someone is going down the river, it's a different disciple with a different temperament. People start saying questionable things about Ramakrishna. This man is so big, he begins to roar like a lion. He grabs the edge of the ferry boat. He begins to rock the boat with so much force that the waves are beginning to come and it looks like the boat's going to capsize. He says, you take back the evil things you said about my guru, or I will sink this boat and drown us all. You know, and they get very terrified and they agree that they're not going to say anything and they take it all back. Please, sir, we didn't mean it. When he lands, Ramakrishna's there. He said, really, what do you care what those fools say? Why threaten them? What's all this talk about drowning them by capsizing the boat? What kind of a foolish man are you? Because it was where they were in relation to the center. The first man needed courage. He needed to stand up for what he believed. He needed to risk their misunderstanding. He thought he was being spiritual, but he was being spineless. And so Ramakrishna, his relationship to center was that he was too weak. And the other man had all the fire that he ever needed. And what he really needed to do was to not care what people said. It's exactly opposite instructions, like this. But it all comes together if you think about being balanced at the center. So each one of us, in the course of our spiritual life, when in 1981, Swamiji felt profoundly guided to cease his monastic life, and he met this woman in Hawaii, and they had he felt from her this tremendous spiritual potential in their partnership. That came to nothing, but right after that he met this lovely woman named Rosanna, this Italian woman, and he married her. For about 6 or 7 years, Swami lived as a householder. There were people at Ananda who thought they owned Swami Kriyananda. They thought we had him in the little box where he was supposed to stay. Among the many reasons why Swami felt that a change was needed was he didn't feel it was wholesome for us to have put him into our little box. Also, the entire community was becoming monks and nuns, and it was intended to be a householder community. And what was happening was that people were reasoning it out. Okay, if I'm serious about the spiritual path, I will become a monk or I will become a nun. You know, if a person is serious about the spiritual path, they will renounce the world and they will join a monastery. I am serious about the spiritual path, therefore I will renounce the world and I will become a monk or nun. And I thought there were about 60 monastics at that point. I read someone else who said there were 100. And there were about 10 maybe that actually were really called to that life. But this whole mindset had come, this linear mindset, which is, well, this is the mark, and so I want to go forward, so I have to cross that mark, and this is what it has to look like. And Swami was extremely concerned because he could feel the whole community was just becoming, we were falling into the worst possible spiritual trap, which is thinking in terms of the form and not really thinking about the art of it for myself. So Swami felt guided by Master to move away from the monastic life and set the example of what it was to be a spiritual householder, which he did beautifully, and it completely changed the community. But when Swami first presented this, his primary explanation was, I felt guided by Master to do this. I mean, there was no big, long, I mean, he talked about, you know, Master's mission and the householder life and the importance of it and the necessity to set good examples and all that. And it was all true. But what he really said was, I felt guided by Master to do it. Because that's what the whole spiritual path comes down to, our relationship to our point of origin, which is where the divine lives. And what happened to the community was that whole movement of energy where people had forgotten to feel deeply within their own hearts what God was calling them to do, had been substituted by this external dogma that this is what we're supposed to do. And when Swamiji made such a radical change based entirely on what he felt Master was calling him to do, all the rest of us remembered, oh yeah, that's why we're here. That's why we're here. It's attunement, it's not the form. It's the spirit and the sensitivity with which we do it. And basically the whole monastic scene just collapsed, which was what was needed. And the whole community became very, very different. We got very happy. We had become very strained because we were all trying so hard to be something or to become something or to do something. And all of a sudden we remembered that we're just supposed to rest in our hearts with the divine, do our best, but just let go of all of this should. I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book in terms of just completely messing up your spiritual life. And Swami just took this bold because I felt Master calling me to do it. Well, this is the spiritual path, is to come into the center of whatever the divine is asking of us. So, my friends, we have covered, I think, let's see, 610 and 611 is what we did this evening. And next week we'll start with one more. And then I'm going to take the month of December free because there's always a lot of holiday activities that take a lot of my time. And so it's easier not to do these night classes during the month of December. And I don't mind taking a little break. I can come back a little fresher to it. So we'll have one more class and then we'll start again, I think on the 4th of January, but one more before then. So thank you, my friends.